Really glad to have you all here. And we are going to spend this time with you to share with you the, I would say, considerations or some information on the historical path of Belarus to the, I would say, present situation. It's clear that each country has its own history, each country has its own peculiarities, tendencies. They are well written, well analyzed, well established, I would say, but maybe not in case of Belarus, because as you all know, of course, this is a country in the center of Europe. By the way, there is one theory that says that the geographical center of Europe is right in the middle of Belarus. I visited this place. It's a field like 50 kilometers away from Minsk, where we have a special sign established by the authorities and recognized by UNESCO as the geographical center of Belarus. Although it's not a unique place, it depends on which latitude you draw a line between Portugal, for example, and the mountains of Ural. I know that there are attempts at least to establish such a geographical center in Lithuania, in Slovakia, maybe in Poland, I'm not quite sure. But still, here we are. What is more important for the geographical situation of Belarus is that this is the place where we have a watershed between two big basins, the Baltic Sea and Black Sea. So in Belarus, half of the country have a lot of rivers, lakes, interconnected between themselves that would drive you to Baltic Sea, and the other half of the country have the same system of waterways that would bring you to the river Dnieper and finally to the Black Sea. So historically, this was the place where the North, I would say in general, and the South met, trading, communicating, fighting, exchanging cultural values, exchanging different cultural traditions. And that has, I would say, its consequences on the positioning of the country on the map of Europe and the choices or challenges that it always had. Because when we look back at the history of Belarus, on one hand, as you know, Belarus appeared on the political map of the world rather recently, back in 1991, and it was called with other ex-Soviet republics as the newly independent state, NEC. Although unlike, I would say, other Soviet republics, Belarus was not really new. But still, it appeared as a new subject of international law and started its own sovereign life, because what was really new at that moment was the sovereignty of Belarus that was declared back in 1991. But looking back at the history as I started, we should recall that Belarus has a very, I would say, complicated and contradictory history. Sometimes we joke that it is a history with the unprecedented past. But I believe it's important to know the history, to understand the history, in order to draw correct conclusions, or in order to formulate necessary policies to ensure that the country is developing now on the right track, I would say, and make right choices. And I will try to show you how this history background really impacts what is happening, what has been happening in Belarus for the last 30 years of independence, and what is happening in Belarus now. Because as you know, and last week, and I understand that you had a very fruitful meeting with my colleague, Ambassador Latushka, who told you about the current political development of the country and challenges that we are facing, problems that we are trying to solve, and expectations that we have for our future. So I claim that Belarus is not a newly independent country. It's a country that has been known in the history of Europe, of the world, long time ago. Our chronicles say that the first mentioning of the Belarusian city in the politics of that time was back in 862, when the city of Polotsk already was on the map, with its own policies, with its own trade routes, with its own traditions. And on the basis of the kingdom of Polotsk, we've been developing, we started to develop our national identity. Then I should mention that there are very vivid examples of first international treaties concluded by that city of Polotsk with what was known at that moment the Ganza cities, the cities on the Baltic Sea, that in rather detailed way regulated access of the goods to the city, customs duties that should be paid by the merchants, all other questions, how the disputes should be resolved. So these treaties were signed by the city of Polotsk in 1232, in the beginning of the 13th century. Then, starting from this 13th century, a new entity was set up, and you know about that, which was called the Great Duchy of Lithuania. It was a state, as we believe, of Eastern Slavs that used Old Belarusian language as its state language, that used its national symbol of pagonia, the horse rider with the sword, as the seal of the state structure, let's say. And here starts our common history with Poland. We should mention this first union that was signed between the Great Duchy of Lithuania with the Kingdom of Poland in 1385. It was a union of Kreva. We have very interesting cooperation within this union. We've been building our collaboration in different spheres. This state, the Great Duchy of Lithuania, expanded at that moment in the 14th and the 15th century from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and it was considered to be one of the biggest states in Europe. And it united, as you may imagine, the Belarusians, the Ukrainians, some Russians, other nations that were living around. And it was quite an interesting development, marked basically in all maps of Europe known from that time. I've seen a number of them, original maps of 15th century or 16th century, made by hand, drawn basically by hand in Italy, in UK, in Holland, And what is, I would stress this, what is important, basically on all of these maps, you had the Kingdom of Polonia, of Poland, and you had the Great Duchy of Lithuania, but normally with these words, there were words Białoruś, Belarus, Hvitrusland, Lejkorossia, Russia Blanca. That was the words written on those medieval maps that testify that the state of Belarus was really well known in the Middle Ages, and it was one of the active participants of the international life at that time. I would come back to this name, Belarus, that was used on the maps and which is returned basically to the political sphere in the 20th century. But then, all you know, a very special event that happened in 1569. There was another treaty signed in Lublin between Great Duchy of Lithuania and Poland, called Lublinska Unia, Union of Lublin. And that was really the first historical example when two sovereign states concluded a treaty according to which they took the obligations to conduct common foreign policy, basically common security policy, coordinate their actions with third parties, coordinate their internal activity. And not by chance, I mentioned this already to my colleagues in the Warsaw University, I was really impressed in 2004 on the 1st of May when Poland celebrated its journey to the European Union. The Pope of Rome at that moment, Jan Paweł II, Jan Paul II, wrote a letter congratulating Poland with rejoining Europe or with joining the European Union. And it was a big emotional letter of 3-4 pages, but it had an epigraph, starting phrase that sounded like od Unii Lubelskiej do Unii Europejskiej. So that was the motto the Pope of Rome chose to characterize this historical fact. And I may tell you that I was at that moment, on one side, I was glad for Poland. I participated in a very big event, festivity event in Lublin with fireworks, with the symphony orchestra concerts, with state receptions on that. And I felt, I would say, pity for Belarus that was left aside, I would say, at that moment, that didn't have this historical chance to celebrate together with Poland this event. Although, once again, we started this back in the 16th century od Unii Lubelskiej do Unii Europejskiej. And I believe that we paved the way by this treaty at that moment. We paved the way for future integration of Europe. We showed the example, and it was a good example, I would say. We showed the motivation, the courage, how we can build a better future together. And I believe that we shall still come back to this example, and we shall promote this information to the outer world, because this definitely it's our heritage, I would say. It's our achievement that we could be proud of. I would briefly mention that at this period, exactly this period, we've been developing quite successfully in all politically, economically, socially. And the example of that for Belarus was the adoption of the code of laws, which was called Statut Великого Княжества Литовского, a statute of the Great Duchy of Lithuania. And that was the first codified document in Europe at that moment, which regulated basically all fields of life. Political arrangements or political system, economical relations, legal debates, legal quarrels, disputes, criminal penalties, administrative fines. It was a very big and very detailed, I would say, code of laws that was adopted first. The first version was adopted in 1529. There was a second edition in 1566, and third, last edition was adopted in 1588. And can you imagine, it worked, it was kept in force till 1840. We'll come back to this set page in our history of the division of Rzeczpospolita at the end of the 18th century. Last division took place in 1795, and most parts of the Great Duchy of Lithuania were passed to Russia. But the statute of this Great Duchy of Lithuania continued to be applied under the Russian guidance, I would say, until 1840, 45 years more. So it survived the division, I would say, and it remained in force until 1840, when finally Russian authorities canceled that and introduced their own legislation. From that moment, well, basically that was the peak of the development of the, I would call it, Belarusian state, the Great Duchy of Lithuania, which we believe we have as a heritage for the modern actions. And as you all know, yes, it ended at the end of 18th century with the division of Rzeczpospolita obojgu narodów, and it was separated between Prussia, Austria, and Russia. And since that moment, we continued our common history fighting for the independence. And it was a struggle of one century, the 19th century, which finally brought us to the beginning of the century 20 and to the First World War and to the October Revolution in Russia, which permitted to re-establish the independence both of Poland and Belarus. But it happened in, I would say, rather different historical circumstances. Because as you may imagine, when we lost our sovereignty at the end of the 18th century, Russia did a lot to, I would say, rewrite the history, to reassess the events in the history, to impose its own view on the history. And it could be tracked in different fields, starting with the fact that the language of the Great Duchy of Lithuania was called not Old Belarusian, but Western Russian, that the nation of Belarus, or Belarusians, was considered to be a part of the, I would say, Russian root, that in this history, the battles that took place between those two states at that moment were not considered as something important. And of course, this Russian version of the history was really imposed on Belarus, and a lot of targeted things were done to keep it that way as long as possible. But luckily enough, I would say this aspiration for the independence survived this 19th century, and it was sort of revived at the beginning of the 20th century, where first groups of Belarusian, I would call them nationalists, appeared in Russia, when they started to print Belarusian newspapers, when they started to promote Belarusian language, when they insisted on our special right for self-determination. And we come here to this very special period of 1917, 1918. As you know, it was the period of this October Revolution in Russia. It was the tough period of the First World War. And at that period, basically, revolution happened in, as we call it, an old style on the 25th of October. By the new style, introduced later by the Lenin government, it was 7th of November. So we still keep this date read in the calendar of Belarus, at least, to celebrate the Great October Revolution in November. Already in December 1917, the Belarusians convened a special Congress to consider a question of the proclamation of the country as the sovereign subject of international law. But at that moment, this proposal was at the center of severe debate, because on one side we have national forces of Belarus arguing for that, recalling the history of the Great Duchy of Lithuania, recalling the achievements of this state in the medieval Europe. On the other hand, we had communists that believed in the world revolution, that didn't take into account the aspiration of separate nations for independence, and they who didn't consider at that moment Belarusians as a separate nation. And this debate was going on for 1, 2, 3 months. And finally, as you know, the Soviet Russia decided to get out from this First World War on the 2nd of March of 1918. The Treaty of Brest was signed, and the Soviet Russia stopped its active participation in this combat, and Belarus was immediately occupied by the German troops. But it didn't impede the national forces of Belarus to proclaim the establishment of the Belarusian People's Republic, Белорусская Народная Республика, which happened on the 25th of March of 1918. It was a very brave move at that moment, and but as you may imagine, it was a move that was implemented in the conditions of the foreign occupation, in the conditions of war, in the conditions of total disorder. And basically, the initiators of the Belarusian People's Republic did not manage to build it as a full-fledged state. They had some preliminary contacts with foreign governments. They issued some declarations and documents. They pretended to exercise control on the certain territory of the country. But finally, in the wartime, it was all ended in failure. But we still believe that it was an important fact for our history, and we still celebrate the 25th of March as the date of liberty, День воли, paying tribute to the first proclamation of the country as a sovereign subject in the international arena. Then, during the course of 1918, with all the wars and all the battles that we had on the territory of the country, finally the war was ended on the 11th of November, and that is the day when Poland declared its independence. Soon after that, on the first, but basically at the end of December of 18 or 1st of January of 1919, a manifest was published that declared the establishment of the, as it was called, Soviet Socialist Republic of Belarus. So this initiative of March 18 was finally supported by the Soviet governments. Of course, it was inspired by the Belarusian, national Belarusian forces that insisted that the country should have its own identity on the political map. And that was another more successful attempt to establish the country, to re-establish the country on the political map. But in 1919, we had all continued with all the wars, and when it came to the war between Poland and Soviet Russia, following which finally the republic was definitely established with this system of ministries, with the system of control on the territory, and of course under the close guidance of the Communist Party from Moscow, and with the local Communist Party established in Belarus. But still, for the national construction, it was, we believe, an important decision to re-establish this Social Republic of Belarus on the political map. And then we go for the further history of development of the Soviet Union at that moment, which was established on the 30th of December of 1922, and Belarus, together with Ukraine, and as they call it at that moment, the Caucasian Republic, which united Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and Russia. So this were the four founding countries of the Soviet Union, signed this Union Treaty, and finally Belarus' place was confirmed, let's say. Although, as you may imagine, at that moment, Belarus was not a full-fledged subject of international law, because immediately after the creation of the Soviet Union, all external powers of the country were passed from Minsk to Moscow. The centralized system was established within the Soviet Union. But at that moment, in parallel, we had a very strong development of the national identity, let's say, with the education. First university was opened up in Minsk in 21, with the Academy of Sciences established in 26, with cultural development very active, with the promotion of the Belarusian language. And by the way, this Belarus that was established in 1919 had 4 official languages, and they were Belarusian, Russian, Polish, and Jewish. And you still have a chance to see on different symbols in books or even in some buildings in Minsk when the first coat of arms of Belarus was pictured with 4 insignias on that in 4 languages, once again, it's Belarusian, Russian, Polish, and Jewish. Yiddish, not Jewish language. The first BNR, Belarusian National Republic, as I mentioned already, was not fully recognized by the international community. It received only partial recognition. The Soviet Belarus, yes, stated its position and was recognized as the separate state and then as part of the Soviet Union. But we come then to the next page in our history, next important page in the development of the country in the international arena, which is connected to the Second World War. You know that, well, both our countries suffered greatly during that period of 39-45. We calculate that Belarus lost every third of its citizens. Before the war, the population of the country was 10 million, and after the war, it went down to 7 million. And only some 40 years later, in 85, we managed to come back to this figure of 10 million. So it took us 40 years to restore the population of the country during the war. And as you know, with formal definition taken into account the great contribution of the people of Belarus to the victory in the Second World War, the world community decided to invite Belarus as well as Ukraine to become a founding member of the United Nations. We know from the historical books and from the political books that there were different concepts discussed between USSR and USA and other allies at that moment. So one of the ideas were to have all 15 Soviet republics as the founding members of the United Nations. Finally, it was not accepted. Then the USSR came up with the idea of inviting Ukraine and Belarus, and finally, once again, it was approved. Although some reference was made that the United States reserved its right to invite 2 states of the United States to join the organization, if it would be considered necessary. We know that it never came to this point, but the right was reserved, let's say, at that moment. But it was important for Belarus, once again. Why? Because we received another historical chance to be present in the international arena, especially for this, taking in mind this development. The foreign ministry was set up, or was reset in Minsk back in 1944. It was decided once again that each republic of the Soviet Union would have its Ministry of Foreign Affairs with rather limited powers, but it was still an organ of external action. And this ministry became at that moment a ministry of the UN, let's say, because the delegation of Belarus took part in the establishing session of the United Nations in San Francisco. It signed the Charter of the United Nations. The Republic ratified this charter back in 45 and became the founding members with 51 other states, I believe. That was the basically the ratification of USSR, Belarus, and Ukraine that bring this number to the established limit, and the United Nations started to operate on the 26th of November of 1945. With rather limited possibilities, still Belarus had a chance at that moment to speak on the international arena, to present its views on different aspects, to become party to different international treaties. They were in majority multilateral treaties, although there were some bilateral treaties that we concluded at that period. And although looking back at the history of our participation in the United Nations, you would never find a single case when the vote of Belarus would be different from that of the USSR. Well, the same basically happens to Ukraine, but that still promoted a little bit the country, the name of the country on the international arena. And finally, it served a very good sort of a service for recent developments, or rather recent developments, when we come to the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, because I believe that Ukraine and Belarus were much better prepared for an autonomous position, let's say, for initiating autonomous or sovereign actions compared to the other Soviet republics at that moment. So it was not by chance that these two countries, Belarus and Ukraine, together with Russia, initiated basically the signing of Białoruski agreements, Białorusi agreement, Vyskuly agreement, as we call it, in December of 1991, to dissolve the Soviet Union and to declare the independence and sovereignty of its former republics. So there we came to the new page of the history of the country. Although I should mention that before that time, it was a very difficult time. I still remember many things in the period with the perestroika of Gorbachev and Glasnost. We had already a very active movement for the national sovereignty, and the first document to this effect was adopted in 1990, and that was called Declaration on the Sovereignty of, at that moment, Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, which was adopted by the Supreme Soviet, by the Parliament of Belarus, under the auspices, let's say, of the USSR. It was the pretext of to put the country as a separate entity. It was not really tolerated by the Soviet authorities. This declaration was not a legally binding act at that moment, but it became a law after the coup d'etat of August of 1991. As you know, in Moscow, there was an attempt to override these perestroika tendencies. And following this coup d'etat, the Parliament of Belarus adopted a decision to consider this declaration a national law. And so that was the starting point of building the sovereignty of the country. By the way, today is 2nd of March, and it is the 19th birthday of first and only president of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was on the news today recalling once again all those events, saying that he didn't, he rules out any other decisions that he could have taken at that moment. So he has no regrets of what he decided back in the 90s, although he still expressed his belief that the Soviet Union should be kept intact and could have been kept intact at that moment. But, well, as you know now, he's a retired person, don't really influence the current policies of Russia. I would say he even is considered to be a critic of what's going on in Russia. So we come to this point when Belarus really proclaimed its independence and faced all the new challenges that were really never known to us in the last 200 years. But by that time, we learned a very good lesson. And here I would come back once again to the history of Belarus. Due to this very specific geographical position, we always faced the necessity or the burden of all kinds of conflicts that impacted our land, that impacted our economy, that impacted our population. And we can cite a lot of examples for that, starting with, I don't know what, Livonian wars between Teutonic and Livonic orders of monks against Russia. And for 30 years, this war was conducted in the territory of Belarus in the 16th century. We have the war between Sweden and Russia, and that was the war which was fought on our territory. We have the war between France and Russia, Napoleon and Russia. That was the war that twice went through Belarus to the east and then to the west. We have the First World War, which was really world war, involving a lot of states of Europe and the world, but the main combat was taking place in the territory of Belarus. We have the Second World War, which for 3 years paralyzed the country and once again led to the loss of 3 million, 1/3 of its population. And basically, I am referring to all the wars that we have nothing to do with the origin of them or with the purpose of them. We were not, strictly speaking, parts of these military actions, but we've been suffering a lot with all the consequences of the battlefield due to this, once again, very specific geographical position of the country. And with all these wars, they happened on our territory, and the authorities, the current authorities at that time of the land, was not really able to find diplomatic, political, or other solutions that could save the country from these military conflicts. So once again, we've been suffering all the losses, all the consequences of the military conflicts without being really involved or being party to them. And that was one of the lessons that we learned from our history, that our national interests require that we had an authority, the possibility to run the country, to plan the actions of the country, to coordinate with the international actors of the country, bearing in mind our national interests. And with latest cases of the wars of 19th century, of the 20th century, we were practically deprived of this possibility. We didn't take part in the negotiations after the First World War, because all the negotiations were made by Russia at that moment. We didn't take part in the negotiations before the Second World War or after the Second World War. They were done by other big players. We came basically to the same situation with the very big tragedy that happened in Chernobyl in 1986, when you know that this nuclear power station in Ukraine blown up. And we received basically all the radiological consequences of that, because 70% of the radiological substances fell on our territory and contaminated 1/3 of our territory. And at that moment, we tried to raise the voice, saying that we need help, we need assistance, we need something. And that voice was not heard neither by Moscow nor by the international community. It brings me to this period to show you that that was really the first moment when we used the international channels, when we used the seat that we have in the United Nations to raise this question for the first time at the level of international community, and finally adopt a resolution of the UN on the Chernobyl accident and on the necessity of international cooperation and assistance to the country that suffered from that. And that was the resolution that was adopted in 1989, which is still takes its own agenda in the United Nations. But that was the first attempt of Belarus to use its diplomatic channels in order to protect, the national interests, in order to promote the national agenda for the international community. And that was quite a successful attempt. I would not maybe go into more details, recalling the very, I would say, nervous position of Moscow, that at the time Soviet Moscow. Although finally we had the support of Russia, as well as, well, many other countries that came to the conclusion that Belarus, Ukraine, and all the consequences of this Chernobyl disaster need to be addressed at the international level, and the tragedy of this kind require the international reaction, I would say. So with this background, we came to the 1991 and to the proclamation of independence of Belarus. And there we had all kinds of challenges, because we opened up a page of speaking to our neighbors. And I could recall very interesting and very fruitful negotiations with our Polish neighbors on all kinds of documents that we needed at that moment: consular convention, political treaty, economic cooperation, border cooperation. So we actively engaged in these activities with all our neighbors, with Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine. We immediately started our cooperation with the structures of the European Union at that time, which was established in '92. And we started the negotiations on the partnership and cooperation agreement at that moment, on the interim agreement on trade, on special sectoral agreements on textile, on metals and other things. We signed the Budapest Memorandum after we took a very important, I believe, decision to move all the nuclear weapons from the territory of Belarus. And we received these guarantees of the nuclear power states of USA, UK, Russia, on the sovereignty and independence of Belarus. So we've been open basically to all possible fields of cooperation, although I would say the the burden of historical past was still there in the minds of the people, and there was some sort of nostalgia for the Soviet Union, and the questions of geopolitical choice at that moment were not really subjects of the open public debates. And in 3 years, let's say, or the first years of the independence of Belarus, we were not ripe, I would say. We didn't come to a point when this question of where we are, who we are, where we go, was not really considered, taken seriously by the society. As you may imagine, that was a transitional period, very difficult from the economical point of view, very controversial on the difficult political developments. And we, at a certain moment, came to the conclusion that we would need a new system, political system in the country, and the presidential post was introduced in the constitution in 1994. And that year we had, I would say, the only free and fair elections, which ended up in the victory of young politician Lukashenko, that really had at that moment a very vast support of the population, declaring his intentions to restart all the factories, to boost all the economic processes, and with some special emphasis with the cooperation with Russia. So all recent developments gave us really no choice of electing or of choosing the ways of political development, because right after the elections, Lukashenko reintroduced the old Soviet symbols, starting with the flag and the coat of arms of the country. Then he signed a special treaty on the community between Belarus and Russia. At the second stage, it was transformed in the union between Belarus and Russia. And third stage was to create a so-called union state between Belarus and Russia that gave very little maneuver, let's say, for the society of Belarus to be active on the other fields. At that moment, the negotiations with the European Union on the Partnership and Cooperation Treaty were concluded, and we even signed this Partnership and Cooperation Treaty, but the ratification process was stopped by the European Union, who at that moment introduced already first round of sanctions against Lukashenko. And so this window of opportunities were really closed for the people of Belarus. So we lived for 26 years with Lukashenko, who converted his authority into sort of a dictatorship regime, and who is now trying to hold on to the power by all illegal means and by all aggressive methods that he has at his disposal. And here we come once again to a big crucial point and big challenge that the Belarusian society faces. As you know, there is a big protest movement against the falsified elections in August of last year, and the great demand of the people to have new and fair elections. At the same moment, we are often asked all kinds of questions, what would be the way of future Belarus? Will it be a close union with Russia, or will it be an aspiration declared to become a part of the European Union? We do not have specific answers to these questions at the moment, and it's really difficult to answer them definitely, especially on behalf of all the people of Belarus. But we do believe that Belarus has always been in the European map. Belarus, as the nation, belongs to European family of the nations. We are happy to be in the center of the continent, and we are happy to maintain good neighborly relations with all our neighbors and with all the continent. We are happy not to create any territorial or political problems in general with in our modern history, because we do not recall, let's say, all the pages of the past, and we believe that we will be able to build very good constructive relations with the states and neighbors that we have for the moment. We realize that with all the historical lessons learned, that Belarus should be considered rather as a bridge between East and West, between North and South. And that is the role it usually played both in peaceful times and in war times. But we would prefer to stay like that for the peaceful future, let's say. Hopefully, we would be able then, once again, at a certain point, to come to a point where we would reconsider the priorities or the opportunities that we could open for the country, both in the West and in the East. But once again, all the historical lessons learned would keep us very cautious, let's say, in making these choices, because what we are trying to do is we're trying to evade all the possible escalations of tensions that could once again break the peace, and we don't want to face these consequences. I should mention maybe as the last point of my presentation, let's say, that unfortunately for the last 20 years, Belarus did not cooperate fully with the European Union structures, with the increased European Union of 28 or 27 member states, due to different factors, basically due to the internal policies that was not considered to be really democratic and progressive by the European Union, because we lived through a period of first period of sanctions, then we had a sort of a period of détente, and starting from 2008, Belarus was invited to become part of the Eastern Partnership, and to my mind, that's a very good initiative and very important initiative that still keeps Belarus or kept Belarus in the EU agenda. We are not quite sure what will happen to this initiative under present conditions, when the authorities of Belarus really took a very tough stand and violated all the human rights and didn't respond to all the calls of the European structures, other countries. Maybe, well, we still believe that the Eastern Partnership has a good potential, and I may imagine that we need to build up our confidence, we need to build up our cooperation using these multilateral formats, we need to build up the knowledge inside of Belarus of the peculiarities, of all the advantages, of all the options that the European Union offers to its member states. And this would pave the way to the new future of the country. And I still hope that this future is not far away thing.